All right. Uh, Hello and welcome. This is the first office hours for the Cartographer open source project in 2023. It's February 7th. You'll have to excuse me. I'm doing a little pinch hitting. I was not expecting to be running the meeting until a moment or two ago. Um, the We have our agenda in HackMD is available. I'll drop the link into the recording. I'm not sure if into the chat. I'm not sure if that'll show up in the recording or not. Um, and yeah, in terms of the normal process, we would be going through outstanding RFCs and then taking any discussion topics. Please, if you have anything that you'd like to talk about, drop things in. As you can see, the RFCs list is currently empty. I would say that well, I would say that the one thing that I can report on, something that I've been championing for quite a while, has been artifact tracing. And so I'll start off there. Artifact tracing is actually, I'll need to grab, I think it's RFC 18. Give me a moment while no, maybe 20. Oh goodness, it's been so long that I don't remember which. The long and short is that there is a challenge for Cartographer to determine, to link what has happened early in a supply chain with what happens later. In Kubernetes, of course, things are eventually consistent. And so we can give the guarantee, hey, if you make a change, eventually the system will become consistent with that change. It'll be reflected in the system. And in the domain that we're working in CI/CD, we often want to give more information to users, such as, where has your change gotten to in this supply chain process? Okay, right now, something's delivered to prod. Which change does that represent? And in order for Cartographer to report that information, it either needs to rely on the components that are being stamped out being clever or conscientious community members in reporting, hey, here's what I've done, or it needs to say, I'm not going to put new work into a component. So if we think of each resource that's stamped out as a step or a stage or a component, I'm not going to put a new change for a stage until that stage reports that it's either healthy or not healthy. So you may remember that last year, one of the improvements that we made was the healthiness feature, where users can tell us, here's how to know if this stage has kind of reached a state of at rest. And so with that knowledge, Cartographer then can say, oh, this is a stage that's currently spinning. It's not yet at rest. It's not in a good or a bad state. So I'm not going to update it with any new information. When that stage does reach an at rest, it either says, yep, I'm good, or no, I'm bad. Then Cartographer can say, all right, great. That output is related to the input that I gave it. And now I can read that, I can propagate it forward, and I can put the latest change that I would want to see. I can update this object now. And so that's something that has, that's an RC that's been in the works for a while, and is a goal of our PM has said that that's a medium-term goal. So I'm hopeful that that's something that we will start working on, but that's not it's not a guarantee. As I said, the proposal was written a while ago, so I personally am like sitting with bated breath, like, oh, when are we going to get to work on it? I will pause there and actually ask the other cartographer engineer, Sam, are there things that you think that we need to discuss today? Things that you would want to put in front of users?
Definitely one of the things that we've been looking at, I mean, like it's been quite a few months on our front. Certainly, we've been getting a lot of feedback from, users internally as well. And definitely one of the things that's been coming up is an issue of like scaling, performance, what happens when there's like hundreds of workloads, those sorts of things. And so, we studied the metrics and we've definitely decided that, we're going to have to pretty much delve into enabling concurrency. And so we've been working, and I think if you've like been looking at the source, we've been making we've got an open pull request right now to enable concurrency that, we've had people kind of stress testing it internally. And I think it's something that we're likely to be merging soon as well. And, I think one of the things we've been cautious about is like if we enable Cartographer with aggressive concurrency limits out of the box, that might, cause unexpected like peaks in people's loads and everything. So I think we're going to kind of tune it down from what's currently in the pull request right now, which I think is like 10. But these are all defaults anyway, and they're all overridable. I think, that's something that's kind of been front and center for me lately. Another one is we've been looking at ways to try and avoid the kind of thrash that happens if Cartographer restarts for any reason. And we have like runnables being restamped. But that's very much like stuff that we've just been like actively investigating based on, what's come back from like a lot of, dog fooding and, user feedback.
Yeah. So that, as I mentioned, those are two things that are currently in the works under consideration. I'm trying to drop in the link for that second one that Sam just described.
Hunted down to right now.
I think I've got the link. Yeah, and let me change the title so it's proper. But yeah, the part of office hours is for us to mention here's what we've been working on, but then the other more larger part is to hear from our users what's been going on with them, what are the pain points that you're feeling, what are the things that you would move the ball the most for you in terms of improving the product. Before I jump into any other topics, let me make sure that we clear the board. Are there any thoughts or questions about artifact tracing?
I have one question around that. There are 3 RFCs in the RFC board on GitHub, and you mentioned the health rules basically, like, is that the path that it seems we're going down from? Because there was correlation rules, there was based off of correlating outputs, and then there was the health rules. Has like that decision been made around health rules, or just wondering?
Yeah, ultimately, the health rules is necessary. The other two are proposals that say, hey, given a its resource that works in XYZ ways, let's short circuit the health rules path by leveraging this behavior. So essentially the health rules is given a generic controller, here's what we do. And then the others are, hey, what if we assume that things aren't generic, that they adhere to an API or some behavior that we can rely upon? Can we improve the performance of Cartographer? And so I like those other proposals, and I'm happy to see them move forward. But ultimately, I would argue that artifact tracing either means yes, we're doing this health rules approach, or no, we're not taking health rules. Like no, like ultimately, I say there's no tracing without the health rules approach.
Okay, so the health rules is the generic approach, and then there's the, like, we have special casing for KPAC to do certain things within Cartographer. We would have special casing for things possibly through the other two that can short circuit that to make it work better with different resources, but health rules is the generic one.
Yeah.
That's the baseline. Okay, cool.
And in terms of ordering and what work I would expect to get done, would expect the generic to happen first. Any other thoughts or questions about tracing?
Yeah, so maybe not strictly related to tracing, but I know there was a roadmap document in the GitHub repo. I was wondering if it's possible perhaps to update it and include this information about the RFCs that will be done at some point, like the artifact tracing, just for yeah, visibility and interesting information. Yeah.
Yeah, so we had a meeting with our PM just yesterday, and I mentioned to them, we've seen in the Kubernetes Slack, questions about, hey, what's on the roadmap, and so I brought up to him, like, hey, I've kind of dropped in some of my thoughts at times, and Rash has done the same. Of course, the product manager is the one is generally the one who owns roadmaps. So yes, well, we hear you there. We will make sure to make that more available, make that more transparent.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks.
Any I'm going to close the book on tracing. Any questions or thoughts about the concurrency, increasing the number of concurrent workloads that can be applied or worked upon in Cartographer? All right, I'm going to take that as a good sign that there aren't concerns. And everybody's like, yeah, that's a great idea. Just go.
Do we have a high, Rashuma, do we have like a threshold that we're starting with? Is there like a target number of workloads that we're looking to do as a part of the RFC, or?
We had a Roman vote yesterday, and the number that won out was 2. So just start slowly.
Yeah.
Make sure, and that would be, to be clear, that would be a default setting in the supply chain choreographer in TAP. Of course, in Cartographer, the setting would be whatever the user wanted to use.
Yeah. Okay. Might be interesting to think about where we might surface that setting. Not just having it stored in a values file somewhere, but also being able to see that in the actual UI if anyone is in there, and having that understanding, because maybe if something happens that they're above that threshold, whatever that happens to be set to, right? We probably would want some type of error, error handling around that as well, right?
I say that totally makes sense, but
Mhm.
also I would say that those are conversations that would happen separately from right. We start off as like, hey, this is the office hours for the open source cartographer stuff.
Yeah.
And so those are just conversations for the VMware closed source product that's
Sorry.
built on top of cartographer.
Yeah, I haven't been to an office hours in a really, really long time, so I apologize for the divergence.
No worries. But none of us have been to one in a while, so you're in good company. Okay, I think that we give time for questions about the two RFCs that we had put forward. John, I see here that you've dropped in a link. I'm going to follow this link myself to artifact signatures, provenance, attestations. Can you talk to? Yeah, I'm going to give you the floor.
Yeah, so Thomas actually filed or started the discussion. I didn't see anybody chime in on it, but it was also back in September. I think it was discussed maybe at the last meeting, but I was just curious for as things have changed and evolved over the last 3-4 months, if there are any current thoughts on these ideas in general. So a background from what I'm looking at, I'm working with the security tools group internally in thinking, but mostly on the upstream open source side. So I'm working with Project SigStore, looking at stuff with OpenSSF and some other areas with like SALSA compliance and things like that. So I'm super curious to hear any ideas or think about how we can bring the idea of attestations and other things, provenance, to Cartographer in a general sense. One of the things that we're trying really hard to avoid is having to build specific attestations for every single tool that exists, because there's too many of them, and our customers want to use all of them. So if we think of building a supply chain with something like vulnerability scanning, we not only want to create a scan report as a part of the process to to do a vulnerability scan, but we also want to attest to that vulnerability scan. And we want to say it was run by a version of this tool that we trust. It was run in an environment that was trusted. At the same time, we don't want to have to do that for Gripe directly and Trivy directly and scanner X, Y, or Z directly. Is there a way that we can create a framework to allow this to happen that also corresponds with the model inside of Cartographer? The closest example, and Thomas brings this up, the closest parallel example would probably be Tecton and Tecton chains. This is where the thing I'm most curious for other people's thoughts, because I don't know enough about this. So it's just like Tecton is not a choreographer. It's an orchestrator. It understands what it's doing. And so for it to be able to add in the ability to attest to the specific actions that are taken by a Tecton pipeline is easier to understand and to do than maybe it will be for Cartographer. But with all that said, I mostly don't know, and I'm curious to hear other folks' thoughts.
Yeah, I will jump in and say that I guess start by emphasizing what you were saying at the end there, John. My default assumption that I'm happy to have somebody push me off of is that at the end of the day, Cartographer is, by using custom resources as our primitive, Cartographer is unable to attest to anything beyond, hey, I created this object on the cluster, and the at the end when it creates, for example, let's say you finish by creating some Knative app, the cartographer could attest to, I created that object because based on some objects that were put on the cluster originally, for example, a workload. But then after that, a number of other objects that I had stamped out, say a Flux Git repository object, gave me information. And I, as cartographer, just kind of have to trust it. Like, did that Flux Git repository give me the source code that is actually supposed to be there? Cartographer, I don't know that there's a way that cartographer can attest to anything beyond like, I created this object and I trust this object, because that's what my template has. Now, one thing that could push it beyond is if cartographer specified if cartographer specified an API for attestation of those individual pieces, so that then we say, oh, we're not going to rely on like a million other tools, like we're going to become the tool that you have to report to. I think that is technically possible. I've always questioned if if the project is at a point where there's just frankly enough political capital to be able to impose that upon the components that we work with. Could we go to Flux and say, hey, we need you to provide some attestation information, and create a working group to do that? That's not something that we've taken on yet. So I'll pause there, because I think that those are two claims that I'm interested in hearing other folks in the community respond to. One, that at current, there's a lot in attestation that cartographer simply can't know. And two, if we wanted to know that, we would need to be creating APIs in partnership with those resources that are most often used in supply chains.
I mean, I will say, I think the same issue exists in Tecton Chains, though, because Tecton Chains, I can put whatever I want within a task. So yeah, I can say that I trust that task, but that's like me saying that I trust the YAML that I'm stamping out through Cartographer, through a cluster image template or a cluster source template. I think that this can be done once we have the tracing, the artifact tracing, because once we can know that input A caused output B, then we can actually start to attest. We can't attest about what the tool did, but we know that we gave cluster image template of resource version X, right? Which is just like the task from some OCI artifact in a Tecton pipeline. It's saying this is the resource that we are attesting to is not Flux. It's the cluster source template and it's the cluster image template. And because I don't see a difference between that or any other attestation that exists out there today, whether it's in a Jenkins pipeline or Tecton Chains or GitHub Actions that are doing it at the level of the steps that are happening, because they don't have any control over what CLI tool you're using inside to do whatever it is you're doing.
Yeah, in Tecton, there's this, basically for each task, they consider the input that goes into the task, the result of the task, like the output that is produced, and what is the container image or the details of the task. So just the specification. Then the container image inside when running can do whatever. But of course, that's very specific, tool specific. But in the final attestation, there's only input, output, and what was the specification of the step. So I guess in a similar way, it could work like that in Cartographer, where instead of deploying container images, we stamp resources. And yeah, for that, we need that tracing, like knowing the inputs, the outputs, and the template from which that output was produced, basically, after stamping the resource, if it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that is something that's definitely on our roadmap. The one piece that you mentioned that I think is a step beyond what we've planned so far or thought through so far is you said tecton chains will capture what's the image that that list of commands is running within. And I think the equivalent for Cartographer, because our primitive isn't an image, or it's neither the image nor that bash script, it's really the cluster and the object, is how do we capture the controllers that are like the controller version that's on the cluster that is reconciling a given object that we stamp out. And it seems approachable from a high level, but I haven't thought through what would be necessary to capture that information. But I assume that it matters if it would matter to someone at some point if you're using Flux source controller version 24 versus version 27.
Right. Or which builder you're using within KPAC if you were creating an image, right? It's also what version of KPAC, but also what version of the builder you're using, because that defines what version of the build pack is being used and what base image and all that, kind of.
Yeah, every little bit, right, that's responsible for this thing, that it passes through, that it runs on, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that brings up I often conceptualize objects and the reconciliation that's going on as there's the spec, there's the inputs that we know of, and then there are quote unquote hidden inputs. And I use two examples. One that you just used, Scott, for KPAC. There are just other objects on the cluster whose configuration impacts what will be the ultimate output on your KPAC image object. But similarly, if you just think of a Git repository object, you stamp it out and you say, hey, here are the inputs that I'm going to give you. It's the name of a branch. It's the address of a repository. And the output of that object is going to depend not just on the version of Flux, but also like, what are the input, like what's the state of that repository at a given point in time? And that's going to change over time, and it's going to change in ways that Cartographer can't observe. And so yeah, I think I think of that as just another example of a hidden input to the output of the Git repository, which is ultimately a pointer to a tarball that exists on the cluster. And so those hidden inputs, I quail at being able to capture them all. It's not clear to me that would be possible.
I think that it may just be necessary to limit the scope of what we mean by attestation to we attest to the cartographer stamping of the resources. We create an attestation of what cartographer knows, not trying. I think it's better to not delve at all into the world of understanding what versions of controllers exist or anything like that if we can't go all the way down. Meaning, if we understand, we know what cartographer knows, our attestation should be about what we know, not guessing, going from the CRD to the controller that manages that CRD to get the version of the image of the KPAC controller that's running, right? Or that gets too tool specific, I think, that it may just be worth saying we attest to the process of a supply chain. This is the input to a step. This is the output to a step. This is the spec of that step that existed, right? And then it's not the highest level of an attestation or the lowest level, however we use the term, but it is attesting to what Cartographer is doing.
It's like, how much of a torchlight do you want to shine on this? And if we just want to decide to solve what we know, and then if, you know, it kind of comes like a platform operator problem right then, right? How do you figure out, how do you fill in all these other empty bits of the Venn diagram, right? There's like some overlap between what Cartographer can attest and what these other components can attest, or could potentially attest, I should say, right? That would make up like a, you know, if you had all of these things, then you'd be able to light the room, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree like that the scope is important, because I would expect other tools to be responsible for part of it. Like I would expect KPAC to provide a full attestation with all information about the builders, the stack, all the build packs used, and all of that by itself. When producing the image, I have raised an issue in KPAC. Actually, I'm looking at an RFC for the Salsa provenance attestation there. So yeah, I agree that we should limit the scope. Like what Cartographer knows can be attested, but then specific tools like KPAC then should do something themselves for all the details, if needed or if necessary. And I guess it's the same thing with Tecton chains. If we run the pack image, I don't think that the attestation contains all information about the builder and the build packs used. That would be something that the specific tool would need to provide, because from the outside, just looking at inputs and outputs, it becomes too much complicated.
I think there's a difficulty there too, of like, how do you bind the attestations that are occurring right in any given instance, right? If you like look at what's currently deployed or what's currently running and what resources are stamped out and actually, like, you know, properly reconciled on a cluster. And then how can you then say like, well, if I've given Cartographer's attestation, which only goes up to a certain border, and I had these other attestations on these other components, which tell me about what happened internally, right? There still needs to be some kind of knowledge, right, of what still, like, you know, what inputs relate to that attestation that thing's talking about, right? Otherwise it feels difficult to like actually draw a seal around all these things and say that these, you know, attestations can actually be collectively added together. Yeah, these are difficult problems, and you know, still.
That's where I think possibly, Sam, like a solution there could be just like we have like health rules in different fields within the templates themselves. We could add a field there, just like we have the output field of where you're going to find the image on the stamped out resource. On what field in the resource can you find the, you know, link to the attestation? And within our attestation, we could add a link there saying, you know, tool specific or step specific annotation or internal annotation or whatever the field would be called within there, saying, okay, if you want to look at the attestation of Flux CD, this is, you know, where that is. If you want to look at KPAC, this is where it is. Having that be optional makes it so we can support any CRD that doesn't do attestations. And if one does, we can that way easily enrich the Cartographer one simply by adding in an optional field in the templates themselves, possibly.
Yeah, I think that approach, that makes total sense to me. And that, I would say, Thomas, when you were describing the issue that you had opened on KPAC, that is what I had envisioned would happen, was that on the KPAC image object, there would be some link to either an object on the cluster or an object available publicly on the internet, or credentials, you know, something. Is the description that I just gave similar to what you had intended?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Also, because I think there can be two different, well, more than two, but two main use cases I can think of is I want to verify what happened across the whole supply chain, and then I can verify all these attestations produced at each steps. But then if I'm a consumer and I got this OCI artifact, the image produced by KPAC as part of the supply chain, then like independently, I can verify the attestation regarding just the image, not the whole supply chain, but the image about how it was built, all the materials, that went into it, and a link to the GitHub repo from where the source code comes from. So there are these two different levels based on the specific need. And this, I like the proposal from Scott about having this link also, that you can navigate from the supply chain to the specific one if it exists, because it doesn't always make sense to have that at each step. But for example, for KPAC, it really does make sense.
Mm-hmm.
What I would expect that KPAC do in the end is they will use the like they have cosine integration today, they'll use cosine to test and not just cosine sign. And then they will give us the image URI of the OCI artifact of the attestation as a field, just like we have latest image. We'll have latest attestation, right? Or whatever, or latest images attestation URI if there's no limit on the number of characters in I don't know what it would be called. That's for Thomas when he writes that RFC.
Yes. So in terms of there's a bit of a first mover question. Should Cartographer go out and create this attestation reader before we have an object example to read? I think that the next thing I'd be most interested in is one, are there examples already existing of Kubernetes resources where they do work and they have some sort of attestation currently? That prior work would be super useful. And if we see, oh yeah, here are 3 examples and they all kind of work the same way, then Cartographer can be really comfortable just saying like, great, we will make sure that we can read things formatted in this fashion. If there aren't examples of that, I suspect we would probably want to talk with, for example, the KPAC team and discuss like, what do you envision building into your resources? Let us know, because we want to be able to read it and we want to be able to pass that on to our users to consume. But all of that makes, that all makes total sense to me.
The only one I know that does it today is Tecton, and the only one I know that doesn't do it in that world is Argo Workflows. So not a project to look at, and a project to look at, and Tecton is used a lot within Carto, right? So there is the idea of how they do chains and looking at how chains exports that information. Maybe worth looking at when the RFC for KPAC gets written as well, to model after how Tecton Chains has done that, which is, in all the sessions I was at KubeCon, whatever, it seems to be the standard that everyone is looking at for the implementation, or it's the example at least that's being thrown around a lot in the community around attestations today in, different tasks. So maybe worth looking at how they did it and then modeling KPAC off of how they did it, if it makes sense, and then utilizing that as well in Cartographer.
Yeah, sensible. That sounds like some to-do items for our team is to take a look at Tecton Chains and see, for example, I'm not clear. Yeah, is the chains a totally separate object that refers to your pipeline runs, or do your pipeline runs refer to your chains? I think it's important for me to know. Cool. Any other thoughts on this issue that Thomas had raised and John pointed us to?
This is just super helpful to hear the conversation. So I appreciate the feedback from all of you. And Wishuma, feel free to reach out to. I think if there's anything I can do to help in this space, I think Thomas mentioned this, that the ITE 6, which is an internal proposal for in toto for attestations, defines a pretty well in general format for capturing the attestations. So hopefully that part is a solved problem. And there's a lot of tools that are starting to build in support for attesting to different statements, as they call them. And SBOMs are a good area where things like different tools that generate SBOMs will also attest to that, and also some of the vulnerability scanners. So there's I can point you at quite a few different tools. And I think on the build front, this is where the Salsa provenance format is becoming more, is kind of like the general standard for what that should look like. I think Co was planning on implementing something that would generate that. I don't know if they actually have or not. They might have been waiting for 1.0. But I can help find something that builds. And there's the Salsa GitHub generator that Thomas also linked to. So that's a GitHub Actions version of something that describes that that provenance as well. So on the lower level tooling front, I can help find anything that is generating those attestations.
That sounds great. Yeah, we're happy to have you both kick off the discussion and to offer to help in moving forward.
Yeah, and I'm also available, of course, any feedback or anything. Yeah. I mean,
we will. I'll take you up on that. Believe me. Thomas, I see we've got just a couple more minutes. Thomas, I see that you've dropped in Cartographer CLI. Talk to us about it.
yes. So yeah, that was a quick thought. A few months ago, the Tanzu Community Edition project was retired, and I know that several examples around Cartographer were using the Tanzu CLI that was distributed via the Tanzu Community Edition project. Of course, it's still possible that the framework and the CLI apps plugin to work with Cartographer is there, can be built from source. I was wondering, what do you think about considering a CLI for Cartographer similar to what Carvel did last year, that the package management functionality was part of the Tanzu CLI, one of the plugins there, and now it's its own CLI that also evolved to have more functionality on the authoring side of packages, and the code base is still the foundation of the Tanzu CLI, so it's not a duplication. But I guess it made a lot easier in the open source space to get more involvement and more or simple onboarding experience, because yeah, it was easy to download the CLI and get started with Carvel. So I was thinking, what about doing something similar in Cartographer? What are your opinions about that?
Yeah, if the app plugin sorry, I'm late, very late. The app plugin has the code you need, that shouldn't be too hard to consume as a separate CLI, right? So there might be very little effort too to get something.
I think it has a dependency on the Tanzu config, but that should be easy to remove, I would think. They have the same issue in the package one where they're depending on the framework.
Sure.
But I think that would be easy to fix.
Sure. Yeah, I would definitely. I know that Gareth thought he might be able to make it today, but Gareth, our technical lead for our program, is also thinking along those lines. So there's a good chance, and definitely bring it up again, because I also wanted to add some extension points for people in the field. One of the things I would like is a way to get a reasonably well scrubbed copy of everything the workload is responsible for, so you can grab a tarball to send to someone to say, hey, what do you reckon's wrong here? You know, some thoughts about things we could add there too. So
I was thinking also something to bootstrap projects or new templates, and perhaps integrate the Cartotest CLI in there. So it's interesting that you're also thinking on those along those lines.
It might come down to us starting a project for you all that you can fork, and if you're really interested, helping us getting that going, because of the design priorities at the moment, but
Yeah,
if you're keen and interested, I think we should make sure we create a project for it.
yeah. I can look into that and perhaps, yeah, write on Slack for some questions, probably.
Appreciate it.
Give it a try. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, like as early as you have thoughts about what bootstrapping might look like, that'd be very curious. Like I'd love to know what you're thinking.
Yeah,
I can tell you, Thomas, for me, bootstrapping, I use a kubectl plugin called creYAML that just templates out any YAML based off of a CRD that has an open API spec and gives you the bare bones template. Go ahead, write your stuff now, like add in your custom logic, but it's the easiest plugin that just for any CRD out there or any resource, it just creates the bare bones template for you. And
I've been wondering about that. Like I've been thinking to myself, God, that can't be so hard, right?
Yeah.
You know, yeah, because we generate our documentation off of the API. I was thinking, should be able to do that on the command line. There you go. It's
Yeah.
already done.
Yeah, it's here, I'm sending the link now in the chat. That's the GitHub for it, and it's literally the easiest thing in the world. It just spits out in the end. What it does is for like if something is a string, it also spits out the type that like the value is the type that field expects to get.
Does it drop in comments with the description above it as well?
It does not do that.
Oh, let's go and fix it. Because that would be
Exactly.
magical. Yeah.
And this is already in crew, so updating it, yeah.
Mm,
But it's a bit old, but it still works very well because
Very cool.
C or D spec has not changed much.
Yeah, looks really interesting. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. All right. Well, we are right at time. I want to say a big thank you to Sam for just jumping in to take notes. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's great to have that record. Thank you as well to all of the external folks that are coming to join this conversation. You know, as someone working on Cartographer day in and day out, every time we see you in the Slack channels making requests or asking what's going on, you know, it's just like another reminder, like, hey, like this is something of value that's being put out into the world, and it's being used to create value for others, and that's just great. So thank you so much. And we will reward you by scheduling this again. We're going to see you guys in a month.
First Tuesday
Rush
is
says,
the 7th again, so it will also be Tuesday the 7th. There's that funny thing with a 28-day month. Nothing changes the next month.
I keep hearing.
Lucky sevens.
Mm.
I keep hearing people promoting the 13-month calendar that make every month 28 days. I'm like, it does sound really nice.
It does. Yeah. Especially as
Yeah,
your brain
try to
starts
figure out what
going.
your birthday is the next year, though. Like everyone has to change their birthdays now.
No. Your birthday would be on the same day of the week every year of your life.
Which is a bit of a pain because everyone will want it on Saturday.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Well, no, but think today your birthday is March 6th, let's say, and next year all of a sudden they make this change. You're going to now have a May birthday.
I can't remember my birthday generally, so.
I mean, yeah, if we added a 13th month, then you would suddenly be.
I'd love to
you
see
might
the
be in
vote
made up
on
month
the naming for that month.
Oh my God.
Think how hard it is for an open source project. Think a month that the whole world needs to agree on.
It was just a wild card name. when you give the name of a month and nobody's heard of it before, they're like, "Oh, you mean the 13th month?"
February.
All righty. Well,
Oh
we
no,
are devolving,
Rashuary.
and so I'm going to get out of Dodge. I'm stopping the recording.
Thank you, everyone.